Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Jason. So for those of you that don't know, Jason successfully defended his dissertation on Tuesday. Was it Tuesday, Monday? One of those days ended with a Y. And now he's officially Dr. Jason, and he has us refer to him around the office that way now, or Your Excellency, or whatever. They all work. No, just kidding. But we're excited for him, and that's just a huge momentous thing for him. So, congratulations. All right. I want to get that out of the way because I knew he wouldn't say anything about it, so I thought I would. There's this phrase that parents use, maybe you've used it as a parent or parents use it on you, that is sort of the conversation enders of all conversation enders. And to pull from A Christmas Story, it's a triple dog dare you threat of conversation enders. And it's a phrase that parents use when kids ask a lot of why questions, particularly when it comes to authority issues. But it's this phrase, it's on the screen here, because I said so. Because I said so, or because I told you so. Did that ever frustrate you as a kid when your parents would use that phrase, because I said so? And maybe for you that are parents in the room, or maybe you've used this phrase. I know as a parent, I have begun to use this phrase. It's amazing. But that answer, because I said so, is equally the greatest and most frustrating answer you can give to a question. Because on one end, it provides certainty, right? Something is because someone in authority has said so. But at the same time, it is equally frustrating because it leaves no sense of certainty, right? Something is, and I don't know why. And I don't know why that's the case. And this is something I've had to start to use with my 4-year-old daughter, Joy. And I know I talk about her a lot, and one day I'm sure she'll be, she'll pay me back. But she's just a great illustration. It just works out that way. But she is what we would call a runner. I don't know if you're familiar with kids that are known as runners, but anytime there is a wide open space, my daughter likes to explore it. You maybe have seen her in this room at times after service, short, blonde, curly hair, running around like there's not a care in the world. But she likes to run. Wide open spaces, why not, right? There's space to explore. And that was a new experience for us as parents because her older brother, Judah, was very much the type of kid that would stick close to us, and he still does, stick close to us. And we could use, this is a tactic that parents use. When he didn't want to leave, when it was time to go and he didn't want to leave, we would say, all right, Judah, goodbye. And he would drop whatever he was doing and run to us. He did not want to be left behind. The thought of it just terrorized him. But with Joy, it's a different story. If she's not ready to go somewhere, play place at a restaurant or whatever, we say, all right, Joy, goodbye. The look on her face says, finally, freedom. She just doesn't even cross her. And Judah's the one he's crying because he thinks we're going to leave her, this sympathetic kid. And she's like, yeah, see you later. Great. Have a good time. But she doesn't understand, in her limited understanding, why it's not a good idea to run in open spaces like, per se, a parking lot. And I'm hoping one day that she gets it. But at times, as I've tried to explain to her why it's not okay to run in a parking lot, and sometimes I try to be really straightforward and say, someone could run you over. I've tried, it doesn't work well. My wife was horrified when I used that kind of language around my daughter. But even then, it just doesn't click. And so I've had to resort to saying the phrase, well, it's because I said so. And that could be really frustrating. And because, in our limited understanding, it's like, well, why would they say that? Why would they require that of me? And I'm sure as adults in the room, as you look back on life, I'm sure there are times when your parent or an authority figure said, because I said so to you, and as you look back on it now, you're grateful that they did. What you didn't see at the time, what they were doing for you at the time was really for your best, but in the moment, it was frustrating, it didn't make sense, but now you look back with perspective and say, okay, I see why they did that. And for students in the room, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but one day, you're going to look back at some of the conversations that you're having with your parents. And at times where they've said, because I said so, and right now it just frustrates you to no end, but you're going to look back and say, wow, I'm so grateful that they did that. I'm so grateful they loved me enough to say no to things that I couldn't understand with my limited perspective. And our big idea today, and this really all fits together, is we are called to be obedient even when we don't understand. We're called to be obedient even when we don't understand. And we're in this series called Living with Uncertainty and looking at this conversation that a prophet named Habakkuk is having with God. It's a really unusual conversation. And he's looking at the world around him. He's looking at at sort of the landscape around him of the society and saying, man, there's so much injustice. God, there's so much around me that does not seem to make sense. It just seems to be out of place with who you are. Maybe you've sort of felt that way as you watch the news or look around, at your life and the lives of people around you. But he's saying, God, why is there so much injustice? And he's wrestling with this, and he's asking God. And last week we saw that God responded by saying, hey, Habakkuk, don't worry about it. I've got this foreign nation. You probably heard of them, Babylon, big bad Babylon. They're going to go ahead and take care of that. I'm going to have them distribute out the justice that I'd like to do. But thankfully, that's not where the conversation is going to end. And today, as we wrap up Habakkuk chapter 1 and just sort of start into Habakkuk chapter 2, we're going to see how does he sort of deal with what God's response was, God's answer of, I'm going to take care of it. I got this foreign nation that's going to take care of it. How does he deal with that? And so we're going to be in Habakkuk chapter 1, and that's on page 654 in the chair Bibles. And if you don't have a Bible of your own, feel free to use the chair Bible. You can also take that home with you as our gift if you don't own a Bible. You can also use the app, the Creekside Church app. That's also going to have some resource stuff I'm going to talk about that's not going to be available any other way except for on the app today. I'll have it on the screen, and also there's the notes in the program. But let's start reading in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12. It says this, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them, meaning the Babylons, to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. And then the passage is going to take a turn here. It says, but why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is it to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? So this is sort of that gut-wrench response that Habakkuk has to God's answer. And he answers God's question with another why question. And really it's two words, why them? That's sort of his response to what God has said, this is what I'm going to do. Well, why them? And really, I don't think this is as much of a question as it is a complaint. He's complaining to God. He's asked God to resolve the injustice around him, and God is choosing a way to do that, and Habakkuk is saying, why them? And last week, if you were here, if you braved Snowmageddon, and you were here last week or you watched the podcast, Pastor Jason talked about, be careful what you wish for. And Habakkuk is sort of now saying, oh man, why did I wanted God to take care of it, but this is not what I would have chosen. God, why do you have to choose them? And so there's this complaint, there's this frustration with God's method here. And this complaint, we're going to look a little more closely at this complaint because it breaks down into sort of three different ways that Habakkuk is confronting God. And it's going to be really important for us because it's going to help us understand sort of the boundaries and how do we go about complaining to God, wrestling with God, asking tough questions to God. And so we're going to see this, that Habakkuk is confronting God. He's complaining to God based first on his character. He's confronting God based on his character. It says in verse 12, it says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Habakkuk is reminding God of who he is. Say, God, you're from everlasting. God, you are sovereign. You have ordained judgment. God, this is who you are. That's how he starts this confrontation, this complaint to God is, God, this is who you are. And then he confronts God based on his reputation. In verse 13, it says, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Habakkuk is reminding God of what he's done. He's saying, God, listen, you are holy. You are set apart. You're utterly and completely different from us. And God, you are just. You cannot tolerate injustice. He's reminding God of his reputation and how he's acted with God's people in the past. And why is Habakkuk making these statements? What is he kind of getting at here? Because we already kind of know what his plan is, right? He's complaining God, why them? And so why set it up this way? It almost reminds me of, and I've never had this happen, thankfully. I only had one girlfriend and I married her, so it worked out well. But the old dating breakup line, you're great. You're a great person, but it's just not working out. Or it's not you, it's me, right? And it kind of seems like Habakkuk is setting this up like, God, this is who you are, but this. But really what's important to note here, what's going on with Habakkuk here is he's sort of reminding himself and setting his perspective right. And I don't want to miss this, because we all have times in life where we're wondering and questioning what God is up to. And it's important that we learn how to wrestle with God, because often we jump right into complaining about the situation that we're in instead of getting proper perspective. And I'm just going to be real transparent, because this last few weeks with the snow has been really frustrating. And it's been really easy to complain, especially when things in life don't seem like they're going your way. It's really easy to complain, and the things that normally don't bother you, all those little annoyances start to magnify and start to show up. In particularly the last couple of weeks, we've had this frustration with our neighborhood tables. And we decided to launch our neighborhood tables. And then we've had snow. And we had to cancel. And all these things that have disrupted. And it's like, God, what's going on here? And we can get frustrated and complain. And we can feel better for like a second, right? When we complain, there's this moment of like, just to get it off my chest, it feels good. But that doesn't really solve the situation. And part of that is we only see from a limited perspective. And just like my daughter, who wants to run through open spaces and parking lots look like a nice level, paved place to run, right? There's lots of open space here. But she's only seeing from a limited perspective. And it'd be easy for her to get frustrated with me at limiting her freedom. But she doesn't see the things the way I do, right? She doesn't see the greater perspective. And so what Habakkuk is doing is, when he's starting by talking about God and reminding God of his character and God's reputation, is he's sort of shifting his perspective to say, God, what are you up to? And beginning to ask the question of, God, what are you doing about this? What do you think about this? And it's a shift in our perspective. And it's important to do that. If we're going to complain and question, we have to come from the right perspective. And there's another thing that's important to note, is it'd be really easy to look at Habakkuk and look at his frustrations with God and his complaints to God and say, man, he had really weak faith. And if he really trusted God, he would just say, all right, and just, say, God, I trust you in this, and we'll go along with that. And I think sometimes we feel like if we question God, or if we're perplexed at what God is doing, that somehow we don't have faith. And I would say that's a mistake if we buy into that today. Because I don't think Habakkuk had weak faith. I think he was just perplexed at why God was doing what he was doing. God, why are you responding the way that you're responding? Trusting God doesn't mean we won't wrestle with questions. Habakkuk sees the eternal character of God. He trusts in his sovereignty, but he's trying to reconcile with God's method. And that's sort of the third way that he confronts God. He confronts God based on his method. In verse 13, the second half, Habakkuk says, why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk wanted God to respond to the injustice of his people. He longed for God to do something, but this seemed a bit much. I think maybe he was hoping that God would just reprimand. There'd be a slap on the wrist, but God saying, no, I'm going to evict you. God is threatening eviction. And he's like, whoa, that was more than I think he wanted or was bargaining for. And at that, it was at the hands of this kind of wicked empire of Babylon. And there's this truth of life. It's really all of life, but this is God's method and our preference don't always line up. God's method and our preference don't always line up. And even just in life, with other people, with things, sometimes, we're hoping that they zig and they zag instead. Right? And there's this tension of, man, I was really hoping and expecting this, but this is what I got. And again, going back to sort of my complaint with the neighborhood tables and with snow, it's like, man, God, you knew the weather was coming, and yet here we are. Like, this would not have been my preference to try to launch a new neighborhood table in Snowmageddon. Like, that's a poor time to do that, but God knows. And God's method doesn't always seem to line up with my preference. And Habakkuk was feeling the same tension. Because see, the Babylonians, God's preferred method here, were not great people. It doesn't take long. If you read a bit about them here, they're not great people. They were corrupt. They treated people like animals. It says in here like fish in a net. And in verse 15, he uses this imagery of a dragnet. If you're not sure what a dragnet is, I wasn't either. Here's a painting of it or a drawing. That's kind of the principle. This large net that they would use just to pull in tons and tons and tons of fish. And there's sort of this imagery that Habakkuk is painting of sort of the ruthlessness and just sort of the size and the power of the Babylonians. He talks about how they hook their foes and they grab them with a net. Then to this dragnet, like their power is like a dragnet. It's like this overwhelming, consuming enemy that is coming to devour nations and the purpose is to build the Babylonian Empire. That is kind of who this enemy is. This is God's method that he is choosing. And it was probably the greatest source of Habakkuk's struggle with God's method of Babylon was that they worshipped their military power. Not only were they not great people and they devoured nations, but then they worshipped that. In fact, it says here, therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. They didn't acknowledge God, but rather they worshiped themselves. And when they had success, they attributed it to themselves and to their might and their power. That was kind of, there was validation for them, a blessing when they saw success. And they didn't worship or acknowledge God, they worshiped only themselves. And Habakkuk is holding up the lives of the Babylonians against that of the people of Judah in this complaint. And he's asking a question I think we've all wrestled with at some point. It's this, is why does it seem like the wicked always prosper? God, why does it seem like the wicked always seem to succeed? And he's not saying it, but I think what is sort of built into that question is this, is I know, God, that maybe you've said this, never out loud, I'm sure just in your mind or your heart. God, I know I'm not perfect, but I'm better than them. God, I know I don't follow you perfectly, but at least I'm not them. In the sense of tension of, God, why are they succeeding even though they don't serve you, God? And here I am serving you, and it feels like everything in front of me is another obstacle. And this is a question that we still ask today. We still wrestle with this. Just as Habakkuk wrestled with it, we wrestle with it. God, I know you're just and fair, but why are you allowing that person to succeed? And that can look lots of different ways. Maybe it's the person at your job place that cuts corners to get ahead, and they're the one who gets the promotion while you are working hard. You're honest, you're integrous in how you do it, and you get overlooked. It's the strung out gal that's able to get pregnant while the couple that is committed can't. It's the drunk driver that survives the accident while the victim doesn't. Right? It's the student that's the bully that ruthlessly kind of attacks other people and never seems to get caught. And what I love about the Bible is it doesn't shy away from these places, these points of tension, these honest questions that we wrestle with. And Habakkuk wasn't the first or the last to ask this. And in the Psalms are full of these kind of complaints. And really what it's called in the Psalms is called a lament. It's just a fancy word for saying complain. And there's a whole genre of laments in the book of Psalms. And one of them in particular was written by a guy named Asaph. And he's struggling kind of in a similar way that Habakkuk is struggling. And in Psalm 73, he writes about kind of the struggle with God's goodness in the midst of wicked people who seem to be prospering. And in Psalm 73, verse 12, I've got this on the screen, it says this: "This is what the wicked are like, always free of care. They go on amassing wealth. Surely in vain I've kept my heart pure, and have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments." That's such raw, powerful words. And especially the middle verse there, "Surely in vain I've kept my heart pure." And maybe there's been moments in your life where you've asked yourself, you've wrestled with the thought of, God, is it really worth it? God, is it really worth it? If it's going to be like this, is it really worth it? Is it really worth following you? It seems like everything is always against me when those that don't even acknowledge you seem to get their way. God, is it even worth it? Surely I've kept my heart pure in vain. And there's a fancy theological term that you get to walk away with today, so this is free. You can use this in conversations or whatever, or Scrabble. It's the word theodicy. And theodicy is a Greek word, and it basically means God justice. That's what it means, God justice, God's justice. And it's wrestling with sort of the problem of pain in the world, or evil in the world. And why does God allow that? Where is his justice in the midst of brokenness that we see around us? And this question of why do the wicked seem to prosper kind of fits in line with that. Another popular question in that vein is, why do bad things happen to good people? And these are questions that we ask, and they're big questions. And I'm not going to attempt to explain it away because I can't. God is so much bigger than me that I can't adequately understand what he's up to. But I just want to take a second and talk a little bit about that. Why do the wicked always prosper? Why do bad things happen to good people? And what we're going to see in Habakkuk, and sort of this perspective idea that he's modeling for us is, and we may not want to hear this today, but here it is. Why do bad things happen to good people? Isn't necessarily the right question. It's not a bad question to ask, but it isn't necessarily the right question to ask. Because what happens is we are basing a sense of morality off of ourselves, in my view of what I believe is good or evil. And again, going back to this concept, right? I have a limited perspective. God sees completely, I see a limited perspective. But also, there's this thing called sin. That is really messy stuff. And sin has this habit, this ability just to wreck everything. It breaks our lives, it breaks our relationships. It breaks even creation around us, suffering from the result of sin, of brokenness. And so some of the messiness of life and the brokenness around us is the result of the fact that we just live in a place that is broken, in need of restoration. And God has come to do that, but he's going to start with us. And so that is part of this problem, is it's a matter of perspective. And when we wrestle with these questions, we have to start by remembering God's character and reputation. We need to shift our perspective. Again, with my daughter, she can't see how running through a parking lot could end badly for her, and because I said so is for her protection. And again, what amazes me is if God was concerned about his reputation, if God was concerned about how the messiness of people's lives would impact our view of him, none of these stories would have made it in the Bible. And yet here they are. Which leads me to believe that God wants us to enter into this place. And if we are wrestling with these types of questions, and there are places in life that just frustrate us and we just cannot reconcile, we cannot make sense of the brokenness, of the injustice around us, God is inviting us into those places to meet him. Habakkuk is brutally honest with God, and he lives to tell the tale. He talks this way with God, and he lives to tell the tale. God isn't afraid of our questions. He wants us to pour out our hearts to him, to participate in our relationship with him, to call things out when they seem not to line up with his character. And how do these people of faith process these big questions? Well, one of the ways that they processed questions and uncertainty in life was by writing it down. And that's how we got the Bible, is God inspired them to write about these things that they were wrestling through. And one of the next steps that I want us to consider today on the Discover card says, express my concerns to God. Express my concerns to God. And what I would encourage you with is if you are wrestling through some of these questions, if there are things in life that just don't seem to line up, you're saying, God, why is this happening to me? God, why aren't you not stepping in here? God, why is there injustice around me? God, why are you using this method to go about what you're doing? As we wrestle with these questions, it's opportunity for us to express this to God, whether that's writing it down, whether it's for you, maybe it's drawing, it's painting, maybe it's voice memos, maybe you just need to write a song. And that's kind of what a lot of the Psalms were. You just need to write a song to God and just say, man, this is where I'm at. God, help me. And when we can express our concerns to God that way, we leave space for him to speak. So I would challenge us, if that is something you're wanting to process, some of this, if you're going to check this, take the next 7 days and just express your concerns to God. Whatever form or method makes sense. But I want it to be something tangible, something that's not just in your mind or just a conversation with someone, but it's something tangible. Because the importance of that is you can look back on that later in life, look back and say, okay, I can see what God was up to, or I can see how God was moving in that situation, but it's important for it to be tangible. And if writing it out, or maybe you call it journaling, however you describe that, is something that you would be interested in doing. I know that's not for everybody, but it's a great way to sort of just process and work things through with God. In the app, the Creekside app, there's like a little graphic there that has 20 prompts for writing to God, and kind of writing out your concerns to God. And those prompts can kind of help you start that process of like, well, how do I even start talking to God? It sort of prompts you in how to start that conversation. But I would just encourage us to express our concerns to God. So let's keep reading, because we've seen kind of how Habakkuk is wrestling with God has said his answer. But verse 1 is going to kind of help turn the corner for us. So let's keep reading in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. It says this, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint. And what I love about Habakkuk's response here, sort of he's ending this complaint to God and saying, all right, God, what do you have to say to this? And are these declarative statements? He says, I will stand on my watch. I will look to see what he has to say to me. This is something that Habakkuk is choosing to do regardless of how he feels. Say, God, I'm going to choose to place myself in a spot where you can speak to me. Because I may not feel like it, but God, I want to position myself in a way where you can speak to me. It's these declarative statements saying, this is what I'm going to do. He's choosing to trust God. And we're called to obedience even when we don't understand. It's choosing to trust. It's choosing to say, God, I will do this. God, will you speak to me? God, I trust you. And next week, we're going to see kind of how God resolves some of this. And so you should come back next week. I'm not going to spoil it. Okay, you got to come back next week to get that. But I do want to resolve the Psalm 73 and Asaph's complaint to God and see how that response to kind of help give us some clarity of what this looks like. So Psalm 73, verse 21 says this, when my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. So I'm just going to stop there for a second. So when we're in like kind of these places of brokenness, of embitterment, we're raw, we have sharp edges, and he kind of describes himself as this brute beast, right? He's wrestling and struggling with these things and these emotions and fears. And he says this, in verse 20, he says, yet, even in this, yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, you will take me into glory. And in the midst, he's saying, listen, God, even though I feel this way, God, I know that you're with me. God, I know that you're going to guide me. God, I know that you are promising your presence from now through eternity. God, I will stand. I will position myself. God, I trust that you are here. God, I trust that you are going to lead me. God, I trust that you're going to guide me. It's these declarative statements of choosing to trust God even when everything around us is, I don't know. I'm not sure. And then in verses 25 and 26, this is beautiful. It says, whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My heart and my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And I love that verse. I love how that ends. Everything in me may fail to reconcile what's going on around me, but my strength isn't in what I can see. This world is not the source of my hope, joy, or peace. God is the strength of my heart. He is my greatest inheritance. It's eternal. God calls us. We are called to be obedient even when we don't understand. I say, God, everything around me may fall apart, but God, my hope is not in this world. My hope is not in my situation. God, my hope is in you. And God, I will choose to trust you. I will choose to follow and be obedient to your call on my life even when I don't understand. And hope is really the key. It's the key to Psalm 73, and it will also be the key for Habakkuk. And on our Discover cards, there's a next step that says, choose to hope in the Lord. choose to hope in the Lord. And again, this is a declarative statement. Regardless of how I feel, I'm going to choose not to hope in myself. I'm going to choose to hope in what God has done for me. And what's interesting, Viktor Frankl was a famous psychiatrist and was also a survivor of the concentration camps in Germany during the Holocaust. And in sort of observing the lives of those who survived the concentration camps, he said this: everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. There's a choice that we get to make in how we respond to whatever life is throwing at us. And yes, life is going to throw things at us that are not going to make sense. And there's going to be times where God's method will seem to not line up with his character and his reputation. But we're called to be obedient. We're called to trust even when we don't understand. Even when his response seems like, because I said so, we're called to trust, called to be obedient. We're choosing to hope not in our situation, but choosing to hope in the Lord. And so that's you today. You recognize, man, maybe things have begun to tear at you, but you say, no, today I'm going to choose. I will put my hope in the Lord. Would you check that next step? Choose to hope in the Lord. And maybe today, you're going to choose that for the first time. Maybe as you came today, you're asking, what's the point of all this? Maybe you've looked at Christianity. Maybe you've seen the lives of people around you. Maybe people that invited you today. And it's like, what's the point of this? There's so much in the world that doesn't make sense. And God is calling you to trust him, to put your faith and your trust not in this world, because it's going to be a fleeting hope if you hope in anything less than God. But if you're longing for hope and peace and joy and love in the midst of all this, it starts by placing your faith and trust in Jesus and placing your faith in him to rescue you, not in things around you, not in other people, but your hope is in him. That he's the one who will guide you, and his presence will be with you from now through forever. And if you recognize today that you want to be close to Jesus in the midst of whatever life is throwing at you, would you check that next step, become a follower of Jesus? And I would love to send you some next steps this week and help you walk along that journey of trusting him more every day. And the last next step on here, it says, memorize Psalm 73:26. And that's that last verse we just read. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. If you'd like to memorize or meditate on Scripture this week, that's a great verse for you to just sort of spend some time maybe writing on in your responses to that, whatever you want to do with that. But if you'd like to memorize with us this week, go ahead and check that next step. Let's pray and we'll respond to this message with communion. Jesus, I just thank you that you provide us with hope. God, it's not a wishy-washy hope. It's not a if things are going great hope that sort of fluctuates depending on what's going on around me. But God, it's a confident hope that you will save us. Regardless of the situations we find ourselves in, regardless of the injustice and the brokenness around us, God, our hope is not in that. Our hope is in you. So, God, I pray today for those that are wrestling with concerns. God, I pray would they, this week, God, begin to express their concerns to you. Lord, it's not a sign of weak faith. It's a sign of saying, God, help me to know what you're up to. And God, would we express our concerns and leave space for you to speak to us. God, would we choose to put our hope in you? God, would we make that declarative statement today? God, we hope not in this world, but we hope in you. So God, today, those that are saying, I need to hope in the Lord, as they take those steps, God, I ask that you would meet them in those places and that your Spirit would empower them, that your presence would be close, that they would know your love and your peace and your joy, Lord, like never before. And God, for those that are for the first time choosing to hope in you, the first time choosing to put their faith and their trust not in this world, not in circumstances around them, not in other people, but God, in you. Lord, would you begin the process of making them new? In their hearts, God, would you give them a new heart, God, a new love for you? God, they would know your presence and know your peace and know your love today, experience your grace and your goodness. So God, we just ask today, God, as we walk through life, and Lord, we ask and wrestle with questions that are so difficult, God, and we don't understand, God, we have a limited perspective. But God, we choose to trust you, choose obedience, God, even when we don't understand, because that's what you've called us to. In Jesus' name, amen.